There we are going. All right, welcome everyone. Y'all know and love our own Kalamazoo Nature Center. I know that you do. I'm gonna give just a little overview of the climate action planning process that's been undertaken. And I'm talking now as the Kalamazoo Nature Center board member and the carbon neutrality co-chair for the Kalamazoo Nature Center. We know that climate change is going to affect every aspect of the mission and goals and programming and education, research, conservation, and facilities management at the Nature Center. We recognize that responsibility to lead within the nonprofit sector and to understand and mitigate our own contributions to climate change. We've done some searching and we believe that we are the first nature center to be explicitly trying to write a climate action plan in order to do an inventory of our emissions as well as our sequestration, which is what Jessica is going to talk to us about today. In recognition of all of this, the Board of Trustees created the Carbon Neutrality Committee January of 2020, and we are charged with creating, adopting, and implementing a climate action plan specific to the activities of the Kalamazoo Nature Center. We are just barely almost complete with our baseline year inventory of 2019 that will include emissions from facilities, from the fleet, and from waste. We're going to be presenting that inventory results to the Board of Trustees in April, hopefully, and then be moving forward with some recommended actions for mitigation, resiliency, and sequestration. Frankly, you know, the way that a lot of organizations would do this is Kalamazoo Nature Center could probably declare neutrality right now based on the roughly 1,500 acres owned and managed. You know, that would offset the emissions that we produce in facilities, transport, waste. Don't worry, that's not what your nature center is going to do, folks. Your nature center is going to separate those activities. We're going to be very, very clear about reductions in emissions, which is sort of, it's not that it's not work, but the easy part. There are calculators for me to use. There are all sorts of templates that I can use for buildings and waste and fleet to get that part done. And some of the recommendations are quite easier, right? Many that you know, efficiency and changing over our energy sources to reduce future emissions. The new and really interesting piece is how can we measure our carbon storage, even our and increase sequestration? Land management and conservation at KNC, of course, as you know, has a really long history, mostly focused in preservation, but over time it's become really proactive. And this proactive sense is really what the Conservation Stewardship team has brought. They were awarded a Michigan Department of Natural Resources Urban and Community Forestry grant to complete a forest inventory and develop a forest carbon management plan that's going to target land management priorities and activities to, again, protect carbon storage and increase sequestration. The development and implementation of this plan is just beginning, all right? This is our first steps, and this is very, very new and very, very cutting edge things that we're going to hear about today. I was once a forester, for those of you that don't know, in one of my previous lives. And so there are definitely times when I envy our guest speaker today and the work that she gets to do. With a bachelor's in biology from West Virginia University, an MS in natural resources from the University of Michigan, she served as the vice president for conservation stewardship at Kalamazoo Nature Center since 2018. I know she's prepared a great talk for you today that will include an overview of forest carbon storage, climate projections, and the process of the inventory. Her team is really just starting and some of the next steps for future planning. So without further ado, thank you so much, Jessica Simons, for being with us here today. It is yours.
Thank you, Denise. All right, I'm gonna try to switch here to share my screen. Lots of flipping around going here. Whoops. There we go. Can everyone see that okay?
Looks
all right.
great.
Wonderful. Well, it is a pleasure to be here today. I really just admire everything that KCCC has been able to do to rally interest and enthusiasm and movement in our community. And so I realize that this is probably a little different than most of the topics that Fridays for Future has covered. And I feel like I need to give a little caveat at the beginning of this. As Denise said, this is just the start of our effort. I was joking before the webinar started that I don't think I've ever presented on something that we haven't finished yet before, but so this is part one. I put the little blurb on there, part 1. I hope that you will welcome me back later this year to talk about what we found on the other end of this process. But frankly, it's complicated enough, and our rationale for doing this is, I mean, it's kind of cutting edge. So we thought that it could be compelling for everyone to hear why we took this on, what we're hoping to get out of it, and how we're going to weave it through what we do at the Nature Center. So first, I want you to stop and just think. I know that I'm speaking to our Kalamazoo community for the most part right now. So you're all pretty familiar with KNC, but I'd be willing to bet that when most of you think of the Nature Center, you picture, Greg with an owl, or you picture kids going off to summer camp. And of course, we do all of those things. But I always like to remind everybody that we do something else too. And at KNC, we also try to play a very direct role in conservation, not only here in Kalamazoo, but as part of regional efforts in Southwest Michigan. And those efforts are tied into broader Great Lakes initiatives. And so what we are embarking on here with our forest carbon study is pretty par for the course for us, of trying to look at the broader themes that are affecting natural resources management, looking at the broader ways that we manage our land and care for our resources and study our resources, and helping to do that in a way that we can connect with our local community. We can play an active role in advancing our knowledge on some of these issues, and then helping to involve everybody in the process. And so that's why, talking about this at the forefront of our study might be a little unusual, but it's because we want to bring you along. And that's why I'm here today. So first off, I want to talk a little bit about land management at KNC. Of course, KNC's job is to connect people with nature, right? And we work to be good stewards of the land that we've been entrusted. And that has taken a lot of different shapes over the years. Historically, we really were in the preservation business, as Denise mentioned. So in the very early days, that meant preserving land so it couldn't be part of gravel mining operations, and protecting the spaces that people enjoyed hiking in or enjoyed picnicking in. Our perspective on that for land management has changed, though, over the years, and we've realized that there are a lot of different things and different priorities that we're managing for. And frankly, at the end of all of that, our hope is to not only be stewards of these resources, but to inspire good stewardship for others as well. And so particularly for this forest carbon study, one of the things I'd like for you to think about is how few people are taking on this work so far. Frankly, we don't know what we're doing yet. We are learning about this as we go as well. This is brand new to us. It's not something that KNC's ever done before. But part of that is being willing to take the risk of how to look at the needs that are in front of us, jump right in, do the best we can, continue to learn from the process, and hope that it sets a demonstration out for others to follow. So from the very beginning, we want this forest carbon effort to be a model where people can learn from what we've done, see what we did wrong, see what we did well, and then use it to inform your own efforts, whether you are out there managing public lands as a local municipality, whether you are a private landowner who has your own property. There are opportunities to consider these kinds of studies and this kind of management as you go forward, no matter what kind of land you have connection to. So specifically, I want to also give you a little bit of background about the land that KNC manages. And this might come as a surprise to many of you, but we have more land than you might realize. So of course, we do have our main site there in Cooper Township, just north of the city, that most of you I'm sure are familiar with, where we have the visitor center, we have Delano Farm there. Those two portions of our property make up about 1,200 acres. But then we have about 300 other acres of land that are scattered throughout Southwest Michigan. So we have the prairie property there right along 131, right by the Calhaven Trailhead. We have some property in Berry County right off of Bullhead Lake. Of course, Urban Nature Park right downtown and the Stryker Nature Preserve. We even own 23 acres out in Berrien County on the south end of Grand Mere Dunes, on the south end of the state park right there. And so when we're looking at a forest carbon assessment, we really are looking at the forested areas that make up that entire base of property that we manage. When we talk about managing land historically, we did want to maintain that conservation legacy that I talked about. That's why KNC was first founded. It was as a land protection effort. But over the years, we have become more focused on protecting our natural heritage and trying to maintain intact, healthy representatives of Michigan's natural communities. We have a lot of diversity on our property. We have beech maple forests. We have rare fen wetlands. We have prairies, a lot of prairie land. We have reclaimed wetlands. We have a lot of different kinds of ecosystems that we represent. So part of what we try to do in the conservation department is to manage those lands well, to prevent those ecosystems from transitioning, to battle invasive species that may be coming in and threatening the health of those systems, and even doing things like prescribed fires and other kinds of management that reintroduce disturbance in ways that actually keep systems healthy. But with all of those goals in mind, as you all well know, climate change is the giant wrecking ball that is coming in on top of all of those other management concerns that we are consistently looking for. We know from models that have been developed from scientists far smarter than I am that the likely climate future for this land that we know and we love and we care for is likely to look very different from what we have historically experienced. So that means big changes in the temperatures that we are likely to have. Everyone on this call knows this, but we know that that means alterations in our growing season. That means changes in our precipitation levels. It means more extreme weather events. All of those things have tremendous impacts on the habitats that we manage. They have huge impacts on the biodiversity that depends on those habitats. We are likely to see very specific kind of outcomes. With that uncertainty in precipitation, we're likely to have more droughts and more flood events, both. That means a huge amount of stress on the plants, on the wildlife that all depend on our land. That means changes in the nutrient balances that we have on our property. And so all of those things are things that we are looking for and managing for, and trying to get a handle on as we think about our commitment to manage the land well at KNC. As one part of that, and this is before we're getting into the forest carbon piece specifically, over the last couple of years, our team has been working with some folks at the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Science, that's NIACS, and they run a program called Forest Adaptation, which has been really, really helpful to us of thinking about what our land management goals are, what our vulnerabilities are, what all the models are saying we are likely to expect for managing our systems, and thinking about what specific actions we can take to maximize the impact to have healthy systems moving forward. And then looking at how much uncertainty there is in the models and thinking about, with limited resources, how we can make the best use of the funds and the capacity and the staff that we have. And so this is kind of the groundwork I'm setting for all of this initiative that we're talking about with forest carbon. And we can look at all of those strategies in a few different ways. So some of that is just response. Right now, we're already seeing changes to our land. And so we are working on restoration efforts. There are some folks on the call right here who've helped directly support some of those restoration efforts. And so things like the sugar bush restoration that we just did, and looking at how we can make those systems more climate resilient moving forward. Those are some of the kinds of things we're working on now. We're looking at resilience. How can we make sure that our habitats stay as healthy as possible so that they can withstand additional stress? We're also looking at adaptation, which is kind of pressing the envelope a little bit and looking at, are there ways that we can be innovative in our land management, maybe planting untraditional species that are likely to do better in the future, maybe looking at what our planting schedules look like so we can be looking seriously at the age classes of trees that we have, thinking about being more resilient moving forward. There are a lot of different ways that we can look at our climate strategies for the land, But from this point forward in the presentation, I really want to talk about the two here on the right side, the back end of the system I've laid out here, mitigation and monitoring. And those are two things that are brand new for us at KNC. We have a long history of doing restoration work. We have a long history of looking at habitat resilience. But this idea of land playing a role in mitigation and looking at what active monitoring looks like, those are new. Those are new for us and a little different. And that's where I really want to focus today. So many of you are very familiar with the carbon cycle, right? So we all know about how carbon moves through our systems, but I tried to personalize it right here. I literally inserted KNC as its own little case right into the carbon cycle. So what Denise started off this presentation talking about is that, yes, KNC now has its own carbon neutrality plan. We aim to be carbon neutral as an organization, and to do that in pretty short order. And so to understand that, we need to know not only what you see there on the right, there's our visitor center that you all know and love. Our visitor center has real emissions tied to it. We know that the utilities that keep that building running, we know that all of the staff activity that takes place, the vehicles that we run, the machinery we use, those create real emissions that where KNC makes active contributions to our own climate emergency. But on the left there are KNC forests. Those also play a role. As we are looking at the emissions we generate, we also want to look closely at what we take up to find out how much of a role KNC's current carbon storage plays in offsetting the emissions that we produce. But then over time, our hope is to better understand how much they uptake on an annual basis so that we can know what we have to do in the rest of our system to make it balance out. And so here's a little bit deeper lesson again in the carbon cycle. Again, many of you are very familiar with a lot of this, but I want to talk at a per tree basis here, or talk right at the forest level for a minute. And so what you can see here, this is an image from climategreatlakes.com, and it shows the role that a forest system plays in carbon cycling in a Great Lakes forest. So you can see the little bits that of carbon that are actually coming back out of the soil from soil respiration on an annual basis. You can see there what trees are taking in due to photosynthesis, but you can also see how much carbon is stored in a Great Lakes forest system on an annual basis. I'm going to move away from this slide for a second just to call attention to specific points of this. And so as I move on, we're going to talk about both carbon sequestration and carbon storage a good bit. And I want to make sure that we have some clarity on the differences in those and how we're looking at them, just even from the perspective of KNC's own work. Sequestration is that active action of how trees are using photosynthesis to actively capture and transform carbon into solid wood material. And so you can see here that photosynthesis, 2.9 tons of carbon per acre on an annual basis, move from the atmosphere into Great Lakes forests. And so whenever we're talking about sequestration, it's that annual uptake that we're talking about at that point. For carbon storage, that's the piece that we're really getting at for KNC's forest carbon study right now. This is the long-term sink. This is the wood that has already been removed from the carbon that has already been removed from the atmosphere and transformed into above ground biomass. That's the piece that we're going to tackle in our study. There is a lot of other carbon that is stored within a forest ecosystem. Those pieces are much harder to understand and much harder to measure. And so we're taking baby steps, one bit at a time at KNC. We're really going to be looking at that 40% there in the trunks and branches. That's the part that we're focusing on in our study and what I'll talk about for the rest of today. So how do you measure carbon in a forest? The old school way is you cut down a tree, you measure it, you have an assessment of how much carbon that particular species grown in that particular environment can hold. You weigh the tree. We are clearly not doing any of that. There are kind of in-between methods. There's a lot of historic data that's available that can let you know that if you have a tree of a particular species, of a particular diameter, in a particular age class, then you can know a lot about how much carbon that particular tree can store. But historically, if you wanted to get at that information, you had to go out and be an old school forester, out measuring every tree one at a time. That's how I got my start in my career. It's a lot of fun, but it's also very expensive if you're talking about 1,500 acres worth of land. That was well beyond what KNC has the scope to do right now. So we are taking advantage of some brand new models that are out there through combinations of remote sensing and some computer models that exist now. You can do a lot more with very limited resources, and we're pretty excited about it. I want to take just a second also, before I get into the KNC part, I have to say there are other people who are doing this right now. There are very few who are doing it at our scale, but it's worth mentioning that the Michigan DNR has one of the first and one of the biggest forest carbon assessment programs going on anywhere in the country. So that the Michigan DNR is already looking at the forest carbon storage and sequestration in 100,000 acres of state forest land in the Pigeon River Forest, the Pigeon River Country State Forest. There we go. I knew I was going to get that whole title wrong. But what's pretty exciting about that, they're not even limiting that they can't timber in those lands anymore, but they're making sure that their understanding of forest carbon means that they can manage the forest so that they are continually sequestering more carbon than they are releasing in their forest through their other forest management activities, which is really a great amount of progress. So I wanted to make sure to mention that. There are also other communities that are doing forest carbon assessments right now. If a city has a tree inventory in place or is about to take on one, just that act of assessing and measuring trees within an urban forest gives you a lot of the information you need to do a carbon assessment. We didn't already have those numbers at KNC, which is why we're taking the approach we are. So as I mentioned, KNC's scale of doing this is pretty new. From everyone we've talked to, nobody else is doing this for just like 1,500 acres of land. The people who are doing forest carbon assessments right now are working on thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres of land at once. So this sort of thing is happening on statewide basis, but nobody's doing it on the small scale. And so we're pretty excited about what this means for us as a demonstration for landowners, and what this could even mean for us in relation to communities or campuses, anybody who manages that kind of sweet spot of land where it's big enough to really do an assessment, but small enough that you can still get your hands on it. So we're working with a company called Sylvia Terra. We have been very fortunate. Sylvia Terra is offering their services pro bono to us. They're excited about using this as a model. Basically, they are working some magic with AI technology, where they're taking remote sensing data, so aerial photos from KNC's property. They're putting that through their algorithms and using known data from the US Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. So for generations, the US Forest Service has sent people out to measure individual trees on private land. And that's where we get all of our numbers. When you see those numbers about nationwide forest stocks and how many trees we're cutting down a year, how much our forest biomass is growing, that's where those numbers come from. And so what Sylvia Terra does is they merge those couple of things. They take that existing nationwide data, and then they take our individual remote sensing data and they mash those together to give us a pretty good estimate of what we think we're going to find on our own property. And so we don't have our data just yet. They're working on it right now. And this is what I said, that this presentation actually starts with a whole bunch of questions of what we're trying to do. And I can follow up later with what we really will get out of it. But when we get the data back from them, we will have our first ever forest inventory for KNC. So they're going to tell us what the species composition is of our forests. We have a pretty good idea of that already, but we don't have numbers that go with it. They'll tell us the diameter classes of the trees that we have and estimated age classes of the trees that we have. And so that's important information for us, even outside of forest carbon. Just thinking of how we manage our forests, this is data that we have never had in the past. but they also are going to give us a snapshot of our current above ground carbon storage. So this is a very fuzzy pixelated image right now. This was like the first view of what we got, but they're going to be able to create heat maps across every one of our properties of where we have forested areas and where they can see the amount of carbon that is being stored. And they'll be able to present that carbon in terms of CO2 equivalents, which is handy because those are the same units that we're using in our emissions studies. So when part of our team is out there looking at our operations, looking at our facility level emissions, we're going to be able to see what on the other end our forests have been able to store. Once we get all of that data, here's where it really gets exciting from a management standpoint. We're going to continue working with our partners at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS. They're going to help us put all of that data into a plan that actually looks at what our land management priorities are, looks at how we weave that into all of the other things we're trying to do with our land, and to make good decisions about what our annual management activities are. So here are the elements that we anticipate moving into that plan. Number one, we hope that this will give us the information to enhance our carbon storage. So making sure that we're protecting the wood that is already binding up carbon on our property, making sure that those trees stay healthy, and then thinking about sequestration also. How can we continue to do better at taking in more carbon through strategic management? Maybe that means protecting certain age classes of forests. Maybe that means planting on certain intervals so that we make sure that we have trees that are doing the most active sequestration possible. We also, as part of this, have to protect our land from future climate impacts. And some of those are things that I talked about early on, making sure that we have the healthiest systems possible so that the systems we have can withstand additional changes in climate. Because even if we're looking at forest carbon snapshot of right now, if our forest health deteriorates over time because of climate impacts, that forest carbon sequestration and forest carbon storage also diminishes over time. So we have to think about how continuing to invest in our forest health actually helps us not only have healthier systems, but helps us on that mitigation standpoint. It helps us continue to do better at locking up carbon with our land. Then we also will be looking at ongoing monitoring. So as I mentioned, the data that we're getting from Sylvia Terra is just that snapshot of carbon storage. It doesn't really tell us how much we're taking up on an annual basis. So we're going to have to continue to work and study to figure out that piece and to figure out how to continually monitor our forests so that we're constantly checking on their health, looking at how we can keep adapting our responses to keep them healthy. And then this comes all the way back to what Denise started with talking about. We have that study, right? We have our team looking at our utilities level emissions. We have that team looking at our emissions from vehicles and operations. We want to see what piece forests can play in that equation. So, I mean, it really is all math at that point. How do we make sure that our forests are helping to cover the emissions that we can't, when we hit that point where we can't reduce any further? How can we do a better job of mitigation, making sure those forests are playing their role in that neutrality plan? Then what? So what's crazy is we're only at the very start of this process, and we already just have this spiraling list of new questions that we have, of things that we're already looking ahead that we know we want to answer over time. And I want to start talking about those because I've noticed that once you put it out there in the world, resources show up. People with knowledge shows up. So I'm just getting it out there. So if you have ideas or resources or interest in any of these kind of areas, these are the areas I believe that we will be moving into as we continue through this process. So one of the things I'm looking forward to how our team can, like I said, understand that sequestration piece and how we can maybe even work with the public to get people out, whether those are volunteer teams, whether those are students, figuring out how we can do the kind of ground truthing we're going to need to do to understand the ongoing process here. The Sylvia Terra work with that aerial photo and computer modeling process that gets us the snapshot is great. we are going to need to continue to monitor this over time. And that's one of the things that KNC is really going to have to figure out. And I hope we can involve the community a lot in that process. Beyond neutrality, I want to make sure that first and foremost, we balance out that equation I showed you, right? So KNC is going to hit carbon neutrality. That's our first goal. We want to shoot past that. Our goals in the long term are how can our lands possibly play a role in carbon banking? Because carbon markets are really emerging as a great way to leverage the potential of natural spaces to help offset what's happening elsewhere. But from a management standpoint, it's also a way to generate revenue that supports that better land management over time. The one thing I want to say about this, though, to keep in mind, carbon banking really is only meaningful when it's taking lands above and beyond what they were going to do anyway. So business as usual for the Nature Center is not that we were doing constant timber harvests and that we're, looking at developing our land. So it's not necessarily meaningful to say that, oh, KNC is going to manage for good habitats. We were going to do that anyway. Where it really becomes interesting from a banking standpoint is if we can figure out ways to go above and beyond what we're already doing to improve our land management so that it's sequestering even more. And that's where we get at this interesting question about how we can continue to play a role in mitigation. We also are going to be working on a brand new KNC land management plan as a whole. Carbon is not something that has ever made it into our previous land management plans. So this is new and exciting for KNC and our evolving standards of how we're managing our land and what all we're looking for. It's going to impact how we look at future forest restoration projects. It's going to impact even how we train our staff. So right now we have 2 staff members enrolled in MSU's Forest Carbon Management short course. We are using this as an opportunity to build our staff's expertise and to continue to expand our own thoughts about what land management means and what we're prioritizing. And then I'm sure many of you who know our lands well were already asking this, well, why are we just talking about forests? KNC has a bunch of other stuff. What about all those lands? We'll get there. Right now, we're just being opportunistic. We had funding available and we had partners available who knew a lot about forest carbon. That's why we're starting with forests. And to be honest, 2/3 of our land is forested. So that seems like a good place to start. Down the line, we do want to get at that question of what does carbon sequestration and carbon storage look like in our prairies? What does that look like in our wetlands? What does that look like in our agricultural fields? And how do we look at regenerative agriculture as part of the overall process of what KNC is contributing to this field? And so there are a lot of questions ahead still, but I think it leaves a lot of really exciting room for growth and for investigation as we learn more. So right now, we are looking to wrap up that inventory with Sylvia Terra. That's coming in moments. The scene I have in front of you right now even is next to our sugar shack. This is actually pre-planting. It was a nice landscape view, so I thought it was helpful to look at. But we're actively making changes right now. If you go back to this same spot at KNC, at this moment, there are new trees planted there, and there are new trees planted there that are planted for a more climate resilient future. And so part of the other work ahead of us is we're continuing our restoration. But our goal now in the short term, by the end of September, we will have a forest carbon plan in place. And so I hope that in the fall, I can come back and tell you exactly all the pieces that went into that. I won't have to preface any of it with why we took it on, because you've already heard that today, but we'll be able to jump right in with the results of our plan. So I know there was a lot of stuff about forests and a lot of stuff about carbon, but I do really appreciate the chance to talk with you about this today, and I welcome any questions that you have.
Yay!
Sharing also.
Let's give her a hand first, everybody.
I'm going to take a drink too.
Yeah, that gives you a minute to take a quick break. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, that was fantastic. Great job. Terry put in the chat, and I'll just lift that up. This idea of tourist attractions, art installations, preserving the woods, the idea of a demonstration forest, right? I know you talked a little bit about being, some of us being able to come out and volunteer maybe in the future and help actually ground truth those inventories. Do you see some other, you know, public involvement, like all of these sort of demonstration areas with the existing properties
Sure.
with carbon plan?
Well, so the beautiful thing at KNC is there are, I would say, a million different ways that people can get involved. And some of the things to think about is that so many of the things we do and so many volunteer opportunities play an adjacent role in this. So yes, the idea of volunteers coming out to help us ground truth is a way to directly interact with the forest carbon piece. But starting in May, we have volunteer stewardship teams that are going to be out there actually helping just to keep that land healthy. And so we're starting twice a month volunteer stewardship program from May through October that you will train right alongside our teams. You will get right out there. You will get to see the habitats we're restoring. You'll get to be the ones restoring it. And you'll get to learn about why we're making certain choices we are out there. So I would definitely encourage people to get involved as far as that goes. But we even have other, you know, for people who have different interests, there are other adjacent ways to be involved. Even things like participating in our Michigan Butterfly Network help us to monitor wildlife on the property and help us to understand trends and to follow those trends over time. And all of those trends can help feed back into our land management plans. So if you are interested in getting involved, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I can put you in touch with our volunteer coordinator. But if there are certain parts of this that have sparked your interest, let me know, because even if we don't have a specific volunteer opportunity tied to certain parts of this action yet, that doesn't mean that we won't soon. And it might be your idea that gets us there. So we would welcome that.
I envision all of you out there
Yes,
doing
yes,
something.
please.
Even maybe enjoying those co-benefits that we talked about. I know we get so serious sometimes and focus on carbon. You know, trees are, it's a beautiful thing, as I think what Terry is saying, right? We can enjoy this living, breathing piece of art, right?
Yes.
Questions for Jessica? Yeah, I see Tim has a question, and then Dave.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks. Pardon my simple-minded ecological knowledge, but my impression is that there's a tendency for land over time, long periods of time, to turn into forest. And I was specifically wondering about, for example, wetlands. I know immediately to the west of the visitor center, there's an area that used to be a pretty wetland, which is now no longer so wet. So what do you do to preserve the diversity of land types, particularly wetlands, on your property?
It almost feels like I set you up to ask that question. I'm thrilled that you asked that question. We specifically have a wetland restoration effort going on right now. So we were fortunate to receive two different sources of funding. One was through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. It's part of the Sustain Our Great Lakes program. And another one was from a private donor. If anyone happens to know Dr. Betty, wait, I'm good. Let me get her her whole title right. Betty Ruth Gomez Lance, who was a professor at K College. A gift was given by her family in her honor. And so through these two different funding sources, we're able to take on a pretty significant wetland restoration over the next few years. We will be doing a lot of work this summer and next summer in those wetlands that you identified. Some of the wetland work around Habitat Haven Trail on the east side of Westnedge, that has started already. We were literally talking in a call this morning about some prescribed burns that we have scheduled maybe as soon as next week. And so two of the main ways, one, we really have to get a crew out there just to do invasives removal. So our teams will be out there with brush cutters. They will be out there with hand tools, removing shrubs, removing trees, and clearing out a lot of that growth that you've seen, exactly what you talk about. We'll also be using prescribed fire and doing that very deliberately in some specific locations over the next few years. Again, trying to reset the kind of natural disturbance that should have taken place in that area, but doing it in a prescribed way with our team.
Thank you. Yeah, Dave.
Jessica, thank you. That was fantastic. I really liked that presentation. It made me think a lot about several large-scale research projects that friends and colleagues of mine and Steve Bertman's have been doing for years up at the University of Michigan Biological Station, where they're actually trying to figure out not only what is the daily, weekly, monthly, annual carbon flux in and out of a forest, but also where is the carbon going that is actually being taken up by the forest. So they have a pretty extensive way to measure. I could put you in touch with the people that run these projects, but just as an example, if you're trying to figure out how much in 2021, how much carbon was taken up by a section of your land, one possibility is to put instruments they're basically expandable rulers that are called band dendrometers around the trunk of a tree, and you can measure in quite high resolution how much bigger the circumference got in a given year. And that, by the equations you're talking about, that tells you exactly, well, tells you think accurately how much carbon, how much wood was made, what percent carbon wood is, and so on. So there are lots of ways to measure what's happening. The band dendrometers are cheap-ish. If you have a really big budget, then there are ways to put a CO2 sensor above the forest canopy and measure which direction the air is moving in. You're interested in up and down, and the CO2 content of the air. That's all you need to figure out, is more carbon going into the forest or coming out of it. And the measurements are taken often 10 times a second. So if you have $200,000, Steve, I'm not sure how much it would cost.
We're going to go with the band dendrometers.
Okay.
Well, to play off of that, the eddy covariance measurements that Dave was talking about are part of a national network called Ameriflux. And I don't know if they are looking for new sites, but maybe they are, and maybe there's a possibility there.
That I appreciate these. This is exactly, I'm going to start giving presentations before we do the work all the time. We get all sorts of good feedback this way. Thank you.
Thank you. I was hoping Dave and Steve would tell you about some of the cool projects they do up at the bio station. If it was any other year, I'd say, road trip, and we'll be going up there. But we'll make that connection a little bit later. I appreciate, Dave and Steve, if you would help me and Jessica get connected with those researchers. Sure. I think that could help us a lot.
Sure.
That would be great. Thank you.
Donna has her hand up, but Tom put in the chat, Jessica, the general, where do you go? And lots of people could probably answer this too, for general information on carbon capture and sequestration by species size and age. And I gave the site for the U.S. Forest Service Inventory and Analysis. That's the place I go to, and that's the place where you can really see the big time forest inventories that Jessica was talking about. You can get down to this species, this age, all those kinds of things. Is there something else that we should be recommending though?
I have found the folks at NIAX to be an incredible resource for all of this. We basically showed up to them and just said, hey, KNC is doing a whole carbon neutrality initiative. We have to figure out the forest piece. We have no idea what we're doing. Can you help us? And they, the ball has just been rolling ever since. And so, I definitely recommend them. Their website also is just a wealth of resources, not only about forest carbon, but just about forest climate resilience and adaptation as a whole. And so even if you're not even getting to the carbon assessment piece, just thinking about how to keep your forests healthier, or just, it's focused on forests, but I think it's probably true of land management in general. They have a great framework for just thinking about how you incorporate climate models into decision making, and I'd really recommend it.
I put the NIAC site in the chat as well for folks. Donna.
Yeah, so this was a really wonderful presentation. I have just a quick question, which is, and I'll take my hand down if I can figure out how to do that. Anyway, are you, Jessica, are you tapping into Indigenous wisdom, any resources? I'm also thinking about somebody like Louis Bonamego, who owns 300 and some odd acres in Lawrence, is just a walking encyclopedia of natural knowledge that he has acquired since childhood. Do you ever tap into people like that?
I would love to. I would love to. So I would say that we haven't yet, but it's absolutely something that we would like to do more of, unquestionably. So if I can get Louis' contact information from you.
I'll reach out to you separately.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question, Donna. And that's in part what I hope we can do with some of the demonstrations as well. How KNC's properties were utilized by native populations long before they ever were trying to be saved from gravel mines and then turned into KNC properties. I think that's part of the overall strategy. And if you're not familiar, Kalamazoo Nature Center has also started an equity, inclusion, and diversity committee and a nice statement on that. And so carbon and equity, right, are our two kind of guiding principles now working in that. And so those two things just need to get integrated. And we would appreciate
Yes.
any resources anyone has to continue to help us do that.
Well said, Denise. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
Terry.
Okay, so locally, I just went and got this. My neighbors made this for me, for my kids. It's a step stool. And they used some wood that they were going to throw away. And so I know 6 guys that do this thing. This one's way old, but if you have that much wood in your midst and you're not going to use it, I'm going to call you later. I got your information, but I think these guys would love to maybe add some materials to your boutique. And
I love that idea. And in fact, we were talking recently. So we, as part of our overall energy efficiency efforts, we're redoing the roof on the whole visitor center and the dome. As part of that, as much as it pains me, a couple of trees may come out. And we've been talking about how we can look at wood recovery as part of our ongoing processes at KNC. And actually, most of you probably don't know this, but my prior life, before I came to KNC, I spent almost 15 years working in emerald ash borer recovery efforts, specifically looking at wood recovery and recycling. So that idea of when a tree comes down, it needs to go to its highest and best use. You're speaking my language. I mean, that is near and dear to my heart. And if anyone is more interested in that topic, I could go on about that for days, but there's a group called the Urban Wood Network. And if you just go to urbanwoodnetwork.org, it is a national network that has developed a lot of strong partners are right here in Michigan, but there are great examples and demonstrations and guides on their website that help communities understand how they can do a better job of recovering wood from any tree removal efforts that they have. Yes, thank you, Denise. You're right on it. Thank you for all the good stuff you're putting in the chat.
I try to be a good facilitator. So for the record, let's give Jessica another big round of applause and show your jazz hands, use those fun Zoom buttons. Thank you so very, very much for coming and letting everyone know about what the Nature Center has been up to and where we're headed and how much we really desire community, further community engagement on every single one of these projects.
Mm-hmm.